You are feeling something right now that has no name in English. Not sadness, not joy, not boredom, something in between, something your brain built in the last 4 seconds and will dissolve in the next 4, and there is no word for it anywhere in your language. That's not a flaw in you. That's a flaw in the dictionary. Somewhere between 27 and 45% of the emotional states psychologists can reliably detect in the human body have no single word translation into English at all, according to cross-linguistic surveys of effective vocabulary conducted over the past 2 decades. So here's the question this is really about. If emotions are universal, hardwired, biological, why do some cultures have a word for the specific ache of missing a place that no longer exists, and English speakers just have to point at their chest and say, "I don't know, I just feel weird"? It gets stranger the deeper you go, because it turns out language isn't just describing your feelings. In some cases, it's building them. Here's what we assume by default, without ever really questioning it, that emotions are a fixed set: happy, sad, angry, afraid, surprised, disgusted, 6 or 7 universal expressions stamped onto every human face regardless of where you're born, like a factory default setting. This idea comes largely from psychologist Paul Ekman, who in 1967 traveled to the remote highlands of Papua New Guinea to study the Four People, a group with almost no contact with the outside world, no film, no photographs of foreigners. He showed them photos of Western faces and asked them to match expressions to stories, and the results matched up so consistently across cultures that Ekman concluded emotion was universal biology, not culture. 6 basic emotions, hardwired into every human brain on Earth. For 50 years, that became the working assumption of psychology, media, and pretty much every emoji you've ever used. But here's the thing nobody tells you. The story doesn't end there. It's only the baseline. And baselines are what documentaries, like this one, exist to dismantle. Start in Japan, with a phrase that has no clean English equivalent. Mono no aware, roughly. The pathos of things. It's the specific bittersweet ache of watching cherry blossoms fall, not the sadness of loss, and not the joy of beauty, but a fused feeling that only exists because those two things are happening at once. The concept was formally named by the 18th century scholar Motori Norinaga, who spent over 30 years annotating The Tale of Genji, an 11th century, 1,000-page novel, arguing that its emotional power came precisely from this untranslatable ache. Here's the mechanism. Cherry blossom season in Japan lasts an average of just 7 to 10 days per tree. That brutal shortness is baked directly into the feeling. You're not just seeing beauty, you're seeing beauty on a countdown timer, and your brain fuses appreciation with grief because it has to, because the flower is already dying while you're admiring it. Sound familiar? It's the same physiological cocktail you get watching your kid's last day of summer break, except English never gave that cocktail a name. So most English speakers just call it bittersweet and move on, flattening something the Japanese language treats as its own distinct emotional category. Now go to Portugal, and to a word Portuguese speakers will tell you, almost offensively, cannot be translated, saudade. It's the longing for something, a person, a place, a time, that may never return, and crucially, that you love the ache of missing. The word appears in the earliest Portuguese troubadour poetry from the 13th century, and by the Age of Discovery, when Portuguese sailors were spending years at sea, voyages under Vasco da Gama that stretched over 300 days one way to India, saudade became almost a national identity, an entire genre of music called fado built around it, fado literally meaning fate. Here's where it gets interesting. Neuroscience actually backs up why this needs its own word. Nostalgia, studied extensively by psychologist Konstantin Sedekides at the University of Southampton, has been shown in his research to activate reward circuitry in the brain even while it produces sadness, meaning you're not malfunctioning when missing someone feels almost good. You're running two systems at once, and Portuguese just had the linguistic humility to admit that combination deserved its own word instead of getting split into happy and sad and forced to pick a side. Travel to Wales next, for Hiraeth, often translated loosely as homesickness, which undersells it completely. Hiraeth is longing for a home you can't return to, sometimes because it no longer exists, sometimes because it never quite existed the way you remember it. Welsh poets have used the word since at least the medieval period, and it surged in cultural weight during the 19th century, when industrialization emptied out rural Welsh valleys. Over 20% of the Welsh population left the countryside for coal and steel towns between 1851 and 1911 alone. Here's the mechanism we're sitting with. Hiraeth isn't really about geography. It's about the fact that memory reconstructs itself every single time you access it, a finding central to the work of memory researcher Elizabeth Loftus, meaning the home you're longing for is partly a home your brain has been quietly rewriting for years. You're not homesick for a place. You're homesick for a memory that's already changed without telling you. Now go to Micronesia, to a tiny atoll called Hiraeth, population under 500 people, studied extensively by anthropologist Catherine Lutz starting in the early 1980s. The Hiraeth have a word fago that blends compassion, love, and sadness into one single emotional unit. You feel fago for someone you love who is suffering, or who is simply vulnerable, like a child or an elder. Lutz lived on the atoll for over a year, learning the language well enough to realize that Hiraeth emotional vocabulary wasn't a smaller version of English emotion words. It was organized around entirely different social logic, built around relationships and obligations rather than internal individual states. Here's the mechanism. In a community of fewer than 500 people who depend on each other for literal survival on a half-square-mile island, an emotion word fusing love with concern for someone's fragility isn't a poetic flourish. It's functional. It's the emotional infrastructure holding the social contract together. Compare that to English, a language shaped by centuries of individualist Western philosophy, and you start to see that emotion vocabulary isn't neutral. It's an artifact of what a society needs its people to feel and act on together. Then there's liget, documented by anthropologists Michelle and Renato Rosaldo among the Ilongot people of the northern Philippines starting in the 1960s and 70s. Liget is often translated as anger, but that's a rough approximation of something closer to a surge of energy, passion, and intensity, the same word used for the fury before a hunt and the passion driving a difficult task to completion. The Ilongot, whose traditional territory sits in the mountainous Nueva Vizcaya region, believed liget was necessary for accomplishing anything meaningful. Too little of it, and you were listless and unproductive. Here's the pivot. This reframes something Western psychology has treated almost entirely as negative. Anger, in a lot of English-speaking cultures, is a problem to be managed, medicated, or suppressed. In Ilongot cosmology, it's fuel. Same biological surge, spiked cortisol, spiked adrenaline, an accelerated heart rate you could clock with a stethoscope. But two cultures built completely different emotional meanings on top of identical physiology. You've got mono no aware forcing beauty and grief into a single sensation in Japan. You've got Saudade turning absence into something almost treasured in Portugal. You've got Hiraeth binding memory and place together in Wales. You've got fago fusing love and fragility into social glue on a half-square-mile atoll. You've got liget converting anger into fuel in the Philippine highlands. Different continents, different centuries, different survival pressures, and every single one of them solved the same underlying problem. Human bodies produce far more distinct internal states than any one language has words for, so every culture built its own patchwork of vocabulary to catch what it needed to catch, and let the rest fall through. That's the unifying thread underneath all of it. Emotion isn't a universal alphabet that different cultures just pronounce differently. It's closer to a shared set of raw materials: heart rate, muscle tension, hormonal shifts, attention, that every culture sculpts into different finished shapes, depending on what that culture needs its people to notice, name, and act on. English happens to have a big, borrowing, absorptive vocabulary, which is exactly why it's been quietly stealing words like schadenfreude from German and hygge from Danish for over a century, not because English speakers don't feel those things, but because they never had a name to catch the feeling before it slipped past. That's also why the internet-born term, Sonder, coined by writer John Koenig in his online project cataloging invented words for unnamed emotions, starting around 2012, spread so fast once people heard it. The sudden realization that every random stranger walking past you is living a life as vivid and complicated as your own. The feeling existed in millions of people for millions of years. It just never had a container until someone built one. So the next time you feel that thing with no name, driving home at dusk, or scrolling past an old photo, or watching someone you love laugh at something you can't hear, understand what's actually happening in that moment. Your body is doing exactly what bodies have always done, generating a raw, wordless signal older than any language that ever tried to hold it. And somewhere out there, in a language you've never spoken, on an island you've never visited, in a century you'll never see, someone already built a word for it. You're not broken for not having the vocabulary. You're just proof that being human always outpaces the words we've invented to describe it, and maybe the gap, that quiet unnamed space between what you feel and what you can say, isn't a failure of language at all. Maybe it's the last part of you that no one else has gotten to yet.